Hi, my name is Jamie. I'm going to be guiding the discussion along tonight. And thanks for coming out to join this important discussion. It's going to be a little bit different than some other conversations that have been happening around this issue. Namely because coming up with this event, we wanted to have a conversation that talked about the significance of this proposed amendment, not just in terms of electoral politics, but also in terms of the organizing that a lot of us are doing in our communities on a day-to-day basis. At the Free Space, many of us don't put our energies towards electoral politics usually, and elections are just sort of a thing that happens that's a little bit different than what the organizing work we usually do is. And so we want to have a conversation not with candidates for office and not with public officials, but instead with people who have been doing some on-the-ground work on this issue. And so that's who we invited, and we'll get to hear from a little bit. The format for this event is going to be in 3 parts. First, we'll have each of our guests do a little introduction of themselves and talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing and why. Hopefully in that kind of first section, I'll also ask some follow-up questions, and we'll get at some of those themes that Andrew just mentioned, as well as a few more of the details about the amendment itself and the effects that it would have. In the second part, we'll be doing some more discussion involving everybody here. We'll probably split into some different small groups, and you'll have an opportunity to discuss with those people sitting around you, digest a little bit of what we've just heard, and talk about what the impacts for you and the things that you do would be. And then the final section, and maybe 3 half-hour sections or so, we will come back to the whole circle and do some Q&A for discussion to kind of round out any last questions that you've got. And we'll plan to be done by about 9 p.m. or so. Also, I want to say I have a cold, so it's difficult to understand it all. I apologize for that. That's why I just give me a wink. I'd like to, before we start hearing from our guests, take a little quick poll of some of the things that motivated you to come and join in this discussion tonight. I'd like to hear from maybe 3 or 4 people out of y'all. What is most interesting to you about this conversation that you'd like to hear about, that'll help guide us as we see which direction we take tonight? Would anybody like to share with that?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
I'm here for the main reason, well, I think it's 2 obvious, so why we're all here. It's like the voter amendment, wanting ID for people who vote, which I always understand is going to make it very, very, very hard for the average person, especially for low income, to achieve. And the other thing is the gay rights amendment. I mean, it's pretty obvious. If you really care about somebody else, it's not a complicated issue. If you really care about somebody else, so what? let them be married. You know, it's not. It doesn't seem to me to even involve politics, or it shouldn't. It is what it is. That's why I'm here.
Do you have an interest in both? Thanks for sharing that. Yes.
What's your name? Sorry. What's your name?
Hal.
There's 2 reasons what really motivate me to spend a lot of my time in the last 7 years, and especially this month, trying to defeat this. Number 1 is because this voter ID amendment, and we've seen this nationwide with 36 other states that have it, it's a corporate, big money, billionaire-driven. ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, is behind this. It was not at all a people-powered movement. Nothing from the citizens or the constituents pushed this up to our legislators. It came from the wealthy corporate influence, and I think this is one way we can really buck the influence of money and power, especially after Citizens United, to restore our democracy and make our voices heard. And the second reason is that I feel an informed voter is a good voter. I'm an election judge, and I want to have people know when they walk in that polling place what they're marking their ballot for. And I think that, voting rights are our fundamental right guaranteed to us by the Constitution. The Constitution should protect rights and not take them away. So
sharing. What was your name?
I'm Catherine Dorr. I'm from Northeast Minneapolis. And I only have a short time because I have to head up to join another group to watch the debate tonight. So I have an event to announce too later. We have a chance.
Great, thanks for sharing.
Great.
Someone else like to share?
I might be a little bit different. I used to live in Minneapolis, just moved back like a week and a half ago, and looked at my ballot and was sort of horrified to see both of these on here, so I at least am here to just figure out a little bit more how my favorite state came up with such stuff. So.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I guess I'm interested in organizing in general, and it seems like by even getting this on the ballot itself, the Republican Party or ALEC was highly organized in order to get this on there, and I wasn't really familiar with the anarchist scene before moving up to Minneapolis, but for the last 5 years I've been in and out of that sort of scene, and I'm just curious to see how those sort of principles will try to out-organize the Republican Party or ALEC, and what tactics.
Thanks for sharing. And how about one more? I just want to share why you came tonight.
It's okay to say free food. Won't take it personally.
That's fine.
Robbie?
I like that. I'm a volunteer reporter at KFAI Community Radio Station, and I am recording this, and I'd be happy to get as many voices as I can into sort of an informational piece I'm doing about the amendment and the arguments for having it pass and against having it pass.
Thanks, and that reminds me also, I should point out, if you haven't already noticed, our friend Karen is videotaping in the back so that those folks who are not here will be able to check it out and play on the Free Space website in a week or two. And if anybody does not want their comments to be on even tape, feel free to say so to preface your comments, or else afterwards, if you'd like to talk to myself or Karen, we can make sure that it doesn't show up in the final version if that's something that you prefer. So it's totally up to you. Is your band?
No.
Can you have you wait until we kind of chime in on the next little one? That'll be okay? So it's good to hear from y'all. So now I'd like to we'll go through our different guests that we have tonight one by one as a little introduction. And I'll mostly let y'all introduce themselves, but I'll kind of guide us through the line here. Starting with on that side with you, Ricardo. Ricardo Levins from Raleigh is an artist activist whose studio is next door to the Free Space. As we pointed out, his poster was in buttons about the amendment, about all kinds of social justice issues over here for you to check out. And I know we've really enjoyed having you next door as a resource. And you wrote an article not too long ago discussing kind of the interplay of the Marriage Amendment and the voter ID amendment, and also have been involved doing a lot of almost strategizing around this issue. So could you talk a little bit about what it is you've been doing and how you see that fitting into your idea of radical and revolutionary politics?
Okay, so just sort of give a general sense of it. This is not just to introduce, but to get into the meat of it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I'm interested in always is how any of these issues that come up fit into a larger picture. I'm kind of privileged in the work that I do. As an artist, I get to work with people in a lot of different kinds of movements. And my attention is drawn to those issues that seem to have larger implications of power. So I guess the question that I started out here was the one that's on the flyer. Could you read the Emma Goldman quote you have on there?
So what we put on the flyer was, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal, which is what they did to Emma Goldman. And of course, in Emma Goldman's time, voting was illegal from a large number of folks. And what we see now is trying to, remove those voting rights from a lot of folks. So they raises the question, well, what does it change?
So, for much of my life, the established parties and the established political interests have, their mantra has been to, if people are getting antsy or rebellious or whatever, is, to try to channel it into the electoral system. So I think it really is worthwhile looking at Emma Goldman's quote and saying, well, all of a sudden they're trying to block people out. What's going on? What's different now? Okay? And as somebody who doesn't, my main interests aren't generally in the electoral system, but what is it that's going on that, to put it in kind of crude terms, what is it that makes the corporate class afraid of voting all of a sudden? Because this really is, as Catherine pointed out, this is coming from ALEC, which is a coalition of some very powerful corporations. And what is it that is going on that they all of a sudden want to sort of shrink the electoral system? And I just want to touch on really three things. First of all, there's what the right wing considers to be the demographic time bomb. The fact that in the not too distant future, people who are not of white European descent will be the majority of people in this country. Potentially that could mean the majority of voters. And in the past, the way they have dealt with that is by offering different constituencies different kinds of goodies. Okay? Different ways to buy in at different levels of the American dream, right? But what's happening right now with the economy is that with growing inequality, there aren't as many goodies that those folks are willing to share. And partly because there's no real place for the economy to expand. If you notice, what is happening to our economy is that the big powers, the banks and so forth, the big interests, are inventing make-believe things to invest in. Securitized derivatives, ways of patenting ideas, of patenting genome sequences. I mean, they're just coming up with inventing new ways to sort of cut reality apart and take ownership of different pieces of it, and then bundle them together and sell them to each other. Okay? So there isn't, none of that creates jobs, none of that really provides anything that they can share with the rest of us. And so what's happening is that our housing system is making people homeless. Our healthcare system is making people sick. Agriculture is making people hungry. So you have this time when the legitimacy of the way things have been going is collapsing. And there isn't the possibility of really being able to share some goodies to try to win that back. So they're just not being able to deliver. And what I want to point out, again, like I said, to me, the issue is connecting it to a bigger pattern, what the F is going on with this, so we can understand how relevant it is to people who want to make real change. And what I want to point out, an interesting pattern, is that until recently, the Democratic Party hasn't particularly paid attention to this either. That even though they're the ones who lose votes and can lose elections because of it, they have stood by quietly, silently, while the system of mass incarceration of African American and Latino folks have been put in place, an immigration system that blocks people. There are millions of people, Latinos, who could become voters and swing the political balance of power in this country if you had real immigration reform. And both parties have been on board with trying to prevent that from happening. In 2000, Al Gore lost the election because of the purging of voter rolls in Florida. Illegal, very racially charged, but the Democratic Party, led by Gore, refused to challenge it. Okay. So, and part of what's going on with that is that the two parties have different strategies for essentially pleasing the 1% who fund them. The Republicans are offering up a Southern strategy. They're saying, we can deliver a white voting constituency based on an apartheid system, where people of color are basically excluded from the system altogether. The Democrats traditionally say we can deliver a really kind of mixed constituency in exchange for giving them some reforms and goodies in an education system and things like that. Except now they can't give, there are no goodies to give away anymore because the corporations aren't interested in sharing them. So, so their biggest fear, I mean right now their constituencies are people of color, unions, working people, and the 1%. And the problem is you can't please both of those constituencies at the same time. So that the thing that scares them more than losing elections is mass Black and Latino activism, because that would tear the Democratic coalition apart. Because you'd have both the 1% and the 99% making demands on the party at the same time, and that just doesn't work. With the Republicans, if their social base and their funders make demands, that's okay, because they're not incompatible. Okay, so that's, I just want to skip through some of this. We can get into more of it in the discussions. So basically what you have is a moment where the Democratic Party is kind of jumping into this sort of late in the game, but their real strategy for years has been kind of the centrist Clinton strategy of trying to court conservative white swing voters. They're competing with the Republicans for the swing voters, so keeping people of color kind of on the periphery and passive is really essential for that strategy to work. So the problem is you have the Republican strategy for how to offer stability to the 1%. You have the Democratic competing strategy for how to do that, and neither of them is going to work. You know, neither of them is going to work because the economy itself is driving, you know, people to basically organize, like a lot of people in this room, around basic human needs, which aren't being met. And you have your central bankers in Europe, et cetera, trying to figure out, having all these emergency meetings, trying to figure out how do you stabilize the global economy, and none of them have a clue what to do. You almost can feel sympathetic with them.
Maybe that would be a good time, because I know we've talked a bunch about how the folks who are on the panel, not organizing about it. You've got the big picture. I'm thinking now maybe that since you mentioned, hey, is driving a lot of people into organizing for basic human needs, and Susan, I think might use to Occupy Homes, Minnesota.
Well, if I could segue that with one line, is that one of the things that makes it very practical to all of us is that the agenda that's driving this, which is to gain control of the political system, gain control of redistricting, appointing judges, and so forth, also, and we discussed this yesterday, also shrinks the jury pool. It's the voting rolls that determine who gets to serve on juries. So whether you're talking about police repression in the community, racial profiling, political trials, etc., it very practically impacts what the outcomes of some of these cases will be. So I just want to put that, because that segues right into what a lot of people are actually organizing, and I recognize people in the room who are dealing with some of these issues on a daily or weekly basis.
Yeah.
So it's a very practical thing. As activists, we not only fight each battle, but we create the conditions within which we get to fight it. And who gets to serve and pass judgment on us is a pretty relevant factor.
Thanks for bringing that point about the jury system in, so that's one of the ones on my checklist to make sure we don't forget. It's often overlooked thing. So to talk a little bit more about organizing stuff, moving on down the line. So Susan Kikuchi, I met you from Occupy Homes, but you're also doing a lot of organizing around the Voting ID Amendment. Could you talk a little bit about what that is you're doing and how it fits into your politics?
Yeah, so I similarly to Ricardo do not come to like a electoral politics is my thing or anything. I went to work for CAPI USA, which is the Center for Asians and Pacific Islanders, because I was interested in getting to know people in the Asian American community in the Twin Cities who are politically minded and who are interested in organizing. And that was something that was important to me, so I wanted to get to know people in that community. And a lot of the work that we've been doing is just getting people to vote, because a lot of the Asian American community locally are first and second generation immigrants and refugees who experience a lot of barriers to voting. And so some of the issues there are language, transportation, like mobility, and just knowledge of the voting process. And so, to me, like the lens through which I first came to thinking about like social justice, like organizing, was a racial justice one. Growing up with the narrative of my family and my grandparents having been interned during World War II, and thinking about what that means to be like a marginal person, and how like when they came to the U.S. they weren't allowed to vote because East Asians were prohibited from becoming citizens at all at the time. And so how voting is sort of like, no matter how superficial or marginal, a signifier of inclusion into our society, and how dire the consequences of that in the material conditions of people's lives, to the extent of like mass internment. And so thinking about then like the voter ID amendment and the Asian American population specifically, but communities of color in general, the Asian American community in the U.S. is, I don't know what the statistics are, just like 3% or something, but is projected to grow to, I think, 10% in the next like 40 years. But something like 2/3 of the Asian Americans in the U.S. are first generation, and so some of these things like lack of familiarity with the political system and a lack of language skills remain issues. And refugees and immigrants, that is the population that my organization is working with, also tend to be highly mobile populations. They tend to be renters. They tend to change their address a lot, and so they don't necessarily have the identification that would be required. And some of the just like very logistical hurdles that the voter ID amendment will create, like removing same-day registration and removing absentee voting, will be significant hurdles for especially the elders in the Asian American community, who are dependent on maybe family members or friends to help them get to the polls, or who take advantage of like early voting and assistance with voting. Many of the older generation of especially in the Hmong community, which is a lot of my organization works with as well, are veterans of the secret war in Laos, and only were able to achieve citizenship because of a special act that allowed veterans to pass the citizenship test without speaking English. And so that inclusion is so tenuous anyway that the voter ID amendment would create significant hurdles for those people. And thinking about I guess the conditions of people's lives as they are affected by elections, because as I mentioned before, like to me, electoral politics are like only interesting to a certain point, and they suck energy out of organizing that is more interesting to me. But the reality is that elections are won and lost by very narrow margins at times, and that especially at the local level, the difference between who your county sheriff is or who your county commissioner is can make a really huge difference in the way things like food food stamps right next to it, or didn't name it. So I guess that's sort of what that fits into my personal policy.
Thanks for sharing that, and maybe later on we can talk a little bit more about what you've been hearing from people as you're talking about the amendment. And also to talk about organizing, next down the line is Ms. Nicole Miller. And you work with Neighborhoods Organizing for Change. I don't advocate with the Northside Women's Space. So can you talk a little bit about what it is you've been doing and how that fits into your own vision for society?
Well, when I first heard about the voter ID amendment, my first thought was, why not? You know, anything to keep democracy fair. I want my vote to count equally, just like everybody else's vote. And if this is going to ensure that, great. And as long as we have avenues for people of low income or that lack resources so that they're able to get these IDs, cool. Then you start scratching the surface and you start realizing all the other subtleties going on. Things like the amendment and how ambiguous it is. For example, it says government issued photo ID. None of us knows what this ID is going to look like. We're all assuming it's going to be a state ID. It could be a passport. It could be some new made-up ID that they decide to create after if the amendment were to pass. It also specifically excludes college and military IDs. And while I can understand the idea around the college ID because there's not necessarily a uniform security policy around college IDs, when an amendment like this specifically excludes a military ID, what that elicits for me is this suspicion of what don't you want military personnel to have a say in? What kind of decisions are you planning to make that they would be opposed to, that you want to in some way exclude them from? Never mind getting into like all the racial stuff. I mean, for me, that is so blatantly obvious. It's the subtleties of it that scare me. And it's the fact that people aren't aware of the subtleties of it that scares me. In doing this work, we've been focused on the north side of Minneapolis and east side of St. Paul. And the crazy thing is once you have a conversation with people and you point out some of these different things, whether that's the fact that 25% of African Americans in the U.S. don't have a government photo ID, or 17% of Latinos in the U.S. don't have one, the fact that elderly and homebound people many times do not have these things because they're not driving cars, they're not buying alcohol, they're not kicking it at the club, they are focused on their housing, their food, and their medication. Okay, you scratch the surface on these things and you explain these things to people, and they very easily go from seeing this as a good idea to going, whoa, wait, something's not right here, and moving from a yes vote to a no vote. So the main thing I've seen in the organizing is we have to talk to people. We have to stop being afraid. Like, my parents grew up with that whole you don't talk about politics and you don't talk about religion. And pardon my language, but I'm on some like, fuck that. We talk about things that are going to harm people. I don't care if it's politics, religion, whatever. If it's going to harm people, if it's going to create an apartheid situation in the world where things are like separate and there's a smaller group of people making all the decisions for a larger group of people, that's not what I learned in elementary school. That's not what I was taught when I took U.S. history. And we need to hold on to those things that we were taught to believe were true, even though as we become adults, we kind of start to realize that a lot of it isn't true. But we can't give up on the beauty behind those ideals. The idea that we're all equal human beings and that we each have a voice in our democracy. And we have to fight for that because, you know, if they can shut out one group, they can shut out another group and they can shut out larger groups. And then in regards to the marriage amendment, I personally find it hilarious that this all revolves around gay marriage. Because me personally, when I go out and talk to people, I'm like, you understand this isn't just about gay marriage, right? I mean, this is about you not being able to have 2 wives if that's what you want someday. Like, this is excluding all different types of lifestyles and ways of relating to people and making it a very narrow scope of what's right and acceptable and what's wrong and taboo. It's not just about gay, this is not just about gay marriage. We're making it about that, but it's not that narrow. It is excluding all different types of relating to people. And when it's all said and done, my understanding of marriage is it's a business relationship. It's 2 people coming together going, hey, here's my stuff, here's your stuff, let's put it all together and share it. If something happens to me, you keep the stuff.
Thanks, Ms. Nicole.
Yeah.
Eric Bosted, next in the line, and you're not Hannah, who we said is going to be on the flyer. He said on the flyer was going to be here. She had a conflict come up so that she couldn't make it. But like Hannah, Eric's been working on the project called Voices for Voting Rights, which has been putting together a video series about the issue. So Eric, could you talk a little bit about what that is, and then we're going to actually show one of those videos.
Cool. Yeah, so I came into this through an organization called Line Break Media that some friends and I run, and we create multimedia supporting movements for justice, social, environmental, racial, economic justice. And so organizing a apprenticeship project convened a strategy table around communities of color and Native American constituencies, and with the sole purpose of figuring out what to do about the amendment. And so personally, I would echo a lot of what's already been said. And for this campaign, it was really filling the gap of voices and representation from communities of color about what the effects would be if voter ID would pass. And because a lot of the organizing that had already been going on talked a lot about the impacts of different constituencies, but Oak's trying to fill the role of and provide sort of firsthand representation of various communities of color. And so what came together was a series of 5 videos from multicultural, multiracial communities. It was Hmong, Somali, Latino, African American, and Native American. And each video talks about the unique history of each community, and then together it provides sort of a collective narrative around what the ID amendment, like what the intent really is around this demographic shifting in America and the changing face of Minnesota. And so, so the importance of continuing the struggle for voting rights. And so there's 5 videos that have been out so far, and a lot of events and a lot of organizing around this. And then there's going to be one more video on Thursday that is sort of a compilation of all of these videos. And then there's also a lot of literature on the table. Right now, this week, there's a media week of action where yesterday was kind of getting set up, and you can still catch up. There's like badges you can put on your social media profiles, and then today was Twitter Tuesday, but tomorrow you can still tweet and stuff. And then, but you can check it out. There's a lot you can write. Don't. So still get on the Twitters.
Still time.
Yes. So check out the Media Week of Action, and I think hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about other ways you can get involved, because we can get into that. So should we play one of the videos?
Yeah, so an example of that, we're going to show the Indian Voices from Voting Rights.
I vote because I want to teach my children that we never give up. No matter what odds we're up against, we keep fighting. That vote is the way to keep fighting.
The history of genocide in this land, and also the way that we were made into citizens of the United States essentially as a continuation of that genocide, is something that makes the issue of citizenship and of voting in United States elections really painful for a lot of Native people.
First of all, I'm a member of the original peoples of North America. And second, I'm a U.S. citizen.
I really didn't have citizenship in the United States until 1924.
Democracy really were principles that Thomas Jefferson and other early founders of the United States government adopted from Native Americans. Well, the principle of democracy basically is that everybody's equal, and the process itself shouldn't exclude anybody. So any effort to make it more challenging to vote is a step away from democracy.
One big issue with the Native community in the voter ID amendment is that we don't know whether tribal IDs would be considered a valid form of identification to vote. I see all the time how many members of our community don't have state-issued IDs. They either don't have IDs at all or they have tribal IDs. So there are a ton of members of our community that would be disenfranchised.
That's a misleading factor when people say that it's free. For us in rural Minnesota, the burden is upon us. So if you're a person who doesn't have a job because there are no jobs available, it's a huge expense and probably something that somebody's going to say, no, I don't need to vote.
Voter ID is voter suppression.
I use my voice and my vote to stand up for future generations.
Keep the road to democracy open for all of us.
On November 6th,
Vote no. Vote no.
Vote no.
Vote no.
vote no on voter ID.
It is crucial that whenever there are issues that affect specific people, that the capacity to produce media independently and distribute it through your own networks and like with representatives from your community is so important, because like the stories that we got from interviewing each community, we learned that only sort of the elders know these stories, and they're passed down, and it's really not being covered by mainstream media or people that are just reporting and getting a story down, and then you might hear that it affects communities of color, but you don't really understand the whole story until it's really being representative of the communities. So.
And to piggyback off of that, we discovered a woman in North Minneapolis named Henrietta Adams, who talks about seeing the whelps on her father's back as a child. And I think a lot of times, especially the younger generations, seem to think things like slavery and not having the right to vote, whether that's for women or minorities or landowners or whatever it is like ancient history for some reason. But we have people alive today that have gone through these things, and for us to be moving backwards so quickly is a scary, scary thought. We have to remember that this is not ancient history. Like, this is living, breathing people that we're talking about.
So the question I have following up from that video is that video, especially so, it had the kind of these tensions between like U.S. citizenship and living in the belly of the beast of U.S. imperialism, and so from those of us who, for whatever reason, do not see so many aspects of this system that we're living under as legitimate, if we don't believe in the legitimacy of this, how do we engage with this issue?
I think the important thing to remember is, we can all desire change and we can all work towards change, but we have to deal with the here and now while we're doing that. And if we ignore what's going on here and now, then all of the work for change becomes muted. Because if there's things happening on the side here and we're just like, I'm not going to pay attention to that, I'm not going to be involved in that, I'm just going to beeline towards this ideal, and then you turn around and they've created all of these policies and structures that completely demolish the work you've done, you end up spinning your wheels. And I think a lot of times that's what happens in our social movements, is that we get so focused in on what we think is the right way and how things need to be and how we got to get it done, that we decide we're just going to shut out all those other things and completely not participate. When I've been out talking to people, I talked to 2 young African American men, and one of them was like, yeah, I heard about this amendment and I'm voting no, and the other guy was like, I don't vote, why bother? And I looked at him and I said, you know what, I totally understand. There's times where I've gone to vote and I'm like, it's the lesser of 2 evils, I'm just not even gonna, I'd rather just not. But the bottom line is, I've always had that choice. And if this amendment, the voter ID amendment, passes, that's one step towards losing that choice of deciding to what level we want to engage in these things. So that's why it becomes critical, because right now we might feel like it's not worth it, it's so corrupt and all these different things. And if we just allow it to continue to spiral out of control, we're gonna wake up one day and have no options left. And then the revolution really begins. The riots and the violence and, you know, it's inevitable. People can only be pushed down for so long. The key is not allowing ourselves to be pushed down and finding ways to maintain and rise above the crap that's going on.
Well, I think it's kind of ironic that we're all talking, or people are talking pretty much about the same thing as far as it's the rich subjugating the poor into their us being supportive of them. It's, in other words, we're all like so busy trying to take care of our lives and focus on our lives and trying to exist that the rich can keep getting richer and the poor keep getting pushed farther and farther and farther and farther down. We're talking about all the same things here, you know. I have voted since 1972. So.
Are you voting on November 6th?
Yes, I am.
All right, that's what I want to hear.
Remember I saw you itching to get in here.
Go ahead, finish with
No, I'm pretty much done. So I had to vent because I've been listening so much that I need to get something off the chest.
But what you're saying is what's prickling up everywhere.
Yes.
I mean, the changes that are happening are tectonic plates shifting in the global economy, in global society. You have this dissatisfaction that's really reaching a boiling point in a lot of places. That's why they want to shut off the electoral vote at this moment to large groups of people. So when you're asked about legitimizing the system by sort of keeping the vote accessible, actually I think what they're afraid of is that at a moment when it's organic that people are raising their voices in protest, they want to keep that out of the polite discussion, the public discourse, you know, which the electoral system is an important part of. You know, so that at the moment it's an attempt to preserve the legitimacy of the system that is forcing them to try to lock the doors against those voices that are likely to threaten it from within.
That's a good point. That's exactly right.
But what I want to say, just a thing about organizing in this context. When I say that I'm not involved in direct organizing, that's true mostly because one of my, sort of a core part of what I do is that I support organizers. You know, that my work is actually meeting with, supporting people who are doing the frontline organizing and helping them think about what's missing, or, you know, so that my connection to that is an organic one. I'm just not doing the door knocking. But when we think about organizing, that, you know, that ALEC was raised, okay, the mill that keeps churning these things out. Now ALEC, this, you know, right-wing think tank with a lot of corporate backing, is behind Arizona's anti-immigrant laws. It's behind Wisconsin's anti-labor laws. The Stand Your Ground law, made famous in Florida. Laws to protect corporations from liability when they screw you up, you know, and damage your health. Laws to facilitate privatization of the public good. You know, so all of these things are on their agenda. Voter restriction is the key. That's what puts them in a position of power so that they can start going down that agenda. You know, because once they can appoint judges, once they can restrict juries, once they can control redistricting, it just sort of continually, there's a lot of doors they get to block behind them once they're in there. But what I wanted to say about organizing is that makes this an organizer's dream. Because if your issue is the Keystone Pipeline, or early childhood education, or you name it, food safety, all of these are in the crosshairs. If there are, you know, the Tea Party, Koch brothers fringe is allowed to really consolidate its power. Now, if voter restriction fails for them, they'll come up with another strategy. But at this moment, this is the central, you know, cornerstone for the ultra-right strategy to take over and implement that agenda. Makes it real easy to explain to people why it's in their interest, though. All you got to do is ask, what do you care about?
And when did they start doing that?
Which?
This voter restriction amendments, like in other states?
Specifically, the laws around voter restriction?
Yeah.
I mean, the, yeah, I mean,
Basically,
the year 2000 was when they when they, excluded a lot of the African-American population in Florida. I mean, the pieces, the laws to keep felons from voting
Right.
are old. And then they started implementing ways to make felonies really, really easy to get in poor communities. So it's been a while, but yeah, in the recent years, the last 4-8 years have really been
Yeah, Ricardo brings up a great point. It's been an ongoing issue. It just hasn't been quite blatant with the amendments and the laws and stuff. The whole penal system is structured to be a way to alienate certain people. And, the fact that we have as many people as we do in prison over weed boggles my mind.
It's just become a right-wing consensus that this is the way to go, is recent.
So let me ask, what has been missing in the organizing around the voter insurrection amendment? For example, I have a job that involves walking around neighborhoods, and up until quite recently, I saw probably a 50-to-1 ratio of the orange vote no, don't limit the freedom of marry signs compared to the vote no and voter restriction signs. So what has changed, and what has been missing, what might still be missing?
Money. When he asked about, the Republicans being able to organize, they're able to organize because guess what? They're not trying to figure out how to feed their kids. They're not trying to keep a roof over their head. They can sit around at a golf course in a ballroom with their drinks and have conversations about how do we do this. Okay?
I think Ricardo pointed out the Democrat sort of party standing aside and quietly not doing anything about the voter restriction amendment because there is a tension between their funders and their base, and I think that is really visible when it comes to the funding and how late the funding came to organizations that were interested in opposing the amendment, and how little came, and how there was plenty of support for the marriage amendment. But I think that, it's just definitely demonstrates the kind
Can
of.
I say a word about that? Because it's really not so much about the funding, it's also about the timing. I spent most of my last 2 years sitting at the legislature watching this voter ID and then it churned through the legislative process. This past spring, the marriage amendment, completely backed by the Republicans, opposed by the Democrats, came out of legislative sessions very early on. So we knew the language of the bill, we knew what we were up against, and they could start organizing right away. They've had major corporate backers that are dumping in hundreds of thousands of dollars against the marriage, on our side, to defeat the marriage amendment. The Pohlad brothers, Mark Dayton's relatives, $300,000 and other big law firms, because they realize this is a business issue. They are not going to be able to attract good talent to their companies to Minnesota if we have this type of amendment on our books. So they've had early on knowledge and lots of money, gotten themselves organized really well. The photo ID amendment was absolutely the opposite of that. That was one of the last bills to come out of the legislature. Every time we went to a committee hearing, they started over. Oh, delete everything we talked about last time and here's the new version. And it was a shifting target. We did not know what we were up against. They kept changing it all the time. And it wasn't until the very end of the legislative session that they finally came up with this very most restrictive bill that they could possibly do. And then we had to get up and running really fast. And it's been a little wonkier issue than the marriage amendment as well. So, it's, and the nature of the thing too, everybody's voting experience is different. There's not a uniform message really that will apply pretty much everywhere, so we've had to kind of parse our messages on this to a great extent. But, what you're saying about funding is true, and I just wanted to point out that it was timing as well.
Any other thoughts on that?
My personal experiences, there's been a huge lack of resource sharing. At NOC, we are 95% field work. We're out talking to people. And the thing that for me has been really frustrating is that we are the ones going out and having these conversations with the people who are most likely to be impacted should this amendment pass. And it feels like we're being funded the least. Which just contradicts everything I hear people saying. I might get in trouble for saying this, but anybody who knows me knows I say what I feel. It's simple things. It's simple things like I'm going door to door over Northside and people are asking me for lawn signs and I can't get lawn signs from anybody. Nobody will share their lawn signs with me because they're focused on their fundraiser and their money and their issue. I don't find that to be righteous. I don't find that to be fighting for justice. There's this a lot of competitive energy that I experience between the different organizations that are so-called working on this issue. And personally, as an African-American woman, I find it offensive that the people making the most money on this amendment are not directly connected to the people that are going to be affected by this amendment. The money that's going into this amendment is not going into the communities that it's going to hurt. It's going into a lot of suburban pockets. And I'm not saying that those people aren't doing genuine work and that they're not doing good work. I'm saying it's something we have to think about. Because how can I go to the Northside community and talk to people about their voting being important and impacting their lives when they get cracked on left and right? When other people get money for their problems. It doesn't add up for me. Yeah, I'm totally getting in trouble for this.
Totally in trouble.
No, I think that's like also like the kinds of tools, like the Voices for Voting Rights, they're like amazing, beautiful, awesome tools that were put together like 2 weeks ago because the big coalition and they rose the occasion and they rose the occasion beautifully, but they shouldn't have had to do that, or that they should have been empowered to do that really.
Yeah, it was great that they were able to. They were the ones that were finally able to get us multilingual literature. Do you know how frustrating it is to go to somebody's door and not speak their language and want to at least give them a basic, here's why I'm here, and not having that available until about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago?
The culturally appropriate narrative about why this will affect people. Yeah.
Well, another thing affecting the way this has unfolded is that we live in a strange looking glass world where, for historical and political reasons, we're surrounded by racism in many forms and in particular structures. And it is considered to be the most horrible thing that a person can do is to point out racism or to suggest that something may be racist in its impact. Whereas racism itself is not such a big deal. But to raise the question is like, oh my God, what are you saying? This is the most horrible thing I've ever heard. And that's one of the reasons that this is so wonky. It's not by accident that this is in fact intended to float under the radar and to not have anything to do in people's minds with the real issues underlying it. And I say that this, in a way, has its roots in the 15th Amendment. In the wake of the Civil War, when black males won the right to vote, or were granted the right to vote, there were all kinds of attempts to keep them from actually voting. And the 15th Amendment said you cannot exclude someone from voting on the basis of their race or whether their grandpapa could vote. You can't do that. So ever since then, these racial exclusion measures, right through Jim Crow, right through the war on drugs, right through the war on crime, have always come disguised as being something else. So this is wonky and technical and hard to understand, not by accident.
Right. And this is disguised as a poll tax. That's the thing that we haven't mentioned so far. This is a poll tax in disguise. This is a way to make it a financial burden on people to be able to cast their vote. And there's a lot of people that they're going to throw their hands up and just feel like, I can't do this. This is too much work. There's people who can't get their birth certificates. Not everybody has the luxury of, having been born in a city, urban hospital where record keeping is, way better than necessarily what it might be in the rural South 60, 70 years ago. There's so many obstacles in there, and they're all going to be related to financial. And this is the first time I've organized a campaign, and it kind of pissed me off because I'm like, of all the things I could be fighting for, I gotta fight this dumb stuff. Really? There's kids starving and people losing their homes, and I gotta put energy into this. And then when I really think about it, if it does pass, the next fight is going to be getting people IDs. We think it was expensive to get the voter ID campaign and the marriage amendment campaigns and all that stuff going. They're trying to keep us in this constant spiral of not having enough. Like, we're always having to shell out money and shell out resources to fight things that we should just simply have the right to have.
You bet.
And there's going to be a whole lot of battle things I think we all want to fight for instead of giving people ID.
Yeah.
So I think this would be a good time to have a little bit more small scale discussion. And what I'm going to propose for that is just pretty simple. Maybe we can get into 3 small groups. Group on this side, and a group in the middle, and a group on this side. And feel free to move around if you want. It's from 10 to 15 minutes. I'd like to invite you to reflect with those sitting around you about what you've just heard. If there's anything that really stands out, if there's any big burning questions you're still having that you might discuss, and that we might get to in the next segment. And if you'd like, you could focus a little bit on the question of, so we've got 3 weeks until Election Day. What might we do in terms of mobilization in those next 3 weeks? If that's a question you're interested in. And I know you wanted to mention an event also before we get into doing that.
I also want to make a comment backtracking on what Nicole and a couple of the other ones have said is, this is really about influencing elections. It's really about public policy. What it will do is restrict the eligible people to vote. That way you'll have only a certain mindset of people elected to office with a certain agenda, and we know what that is. It's not the agenda we want. And then those people will have the legislative power and pass these policies that will make life harder for the 98% of us, or the vast majority of us, and make life much easier for the wealthy and the corporations. And so this is all about eventually not having enough money for our schools, having our roads and bridges fall down, having not enough money to take care of our vets when they come home. And I come from a military family. I saw how that was. Not having enough money to pay for the things that we need to do and make our country stronger and better and our people's lives better. This is absolutely determined to influence the outcome of elections and public policy. And I think so much of the discussion about photo ID has been about, oh gee, this makes sense, everybody needs an ID. You need an ID to buy a drink, you need an ID to get on a plane. It's not about free ID, it's about our future political direction.
Different day, different times. Gotta use your mind, they might try to make you blind. It's alright, cause through it all, you still gon' shine. Stand up for your rights and you'll be left alone. Middle finger to the ones in the middle, wanna take your rights away. The mind is such a bright display. The voter card, I fight the day for Martin, Malcolm, Marcus. I did it, really got to admit it. It ain't hard to say. Put your hands up if you color broken out of work. Ain't got nowhere to go for good and let you know really here it ain't all good. When I look around, I'm looking to discuss. So for once things was looking up. And God we trust, that was all on us. To the new freedom fighters on the bus. We ain't going down, we gon' ride no doubt. Till the wheels fall off with the soldiers now. They move in, we gon' move around like occupied home of the South. It's all hood, we gon' hold together. Ain't deal with the guns now. Can't complain if you don't go, even though I know it feel like your vote don't count. When I'm fair, ain't playing fair. We don't need no one to pay our share. They don't care, equals health scared. That's the two evils, hell yeah.
Ambassador of the brown voice. Me head that we got a choice. Too lit to be heard, recognize where we stand in this planet of man. This is nothing to avoid in a land where scholarship checks void. And we bury our girls and boys to the bullet wounds while they watching the cartoons and news who are more to be deployed. He's a card of soul of God. You can die for 13 stripes. Holies, these are casualties before they even reach our rights. We're the color cursed twice. And now we give more life. Clear parenthood and a dream that can marry a husband or a wife.
I took a peek at the speeches and must have seen a demon.
That video goes on for another few minutes. So you can check
Let it go on!
Alright, that worked! In the meantime, Andrew's going to give a plug.
Alright, so we're doing an ask. We mentioned a little bit about the free space before. The free space is run completely on donations from friends and from people who use the space. We use it to pay rent and mostly rent, and then like materials and be able to do things like this. So if anyone is able to contribute, we're going to pass this vase around, and anything would be helpful to make sure that we continue this.
A couple of organizations have done some outstanding studies about this. Citizens for Election Integrity Minnesota, and we were in existence in 2005, so this is not just because of the ID thing. CEIMN.org has issued a number of reports. We did one in November 2010 on the felon voting issue, problem. We just did another one on the statewide cost of this thing. Greater MN Counts is a report that just came out in September about the cost to every county in the state of Minnesota, and the cost is phenomenal. And League of Women Voters of Minnesota, LWVMN, has 6 short videos and a lot of other information on their pages. So there's places you can go to read about this and learn more about it if you want to get more information. CEIMN.org, LWVMN.org, and GreaterMNCounts.org.
Do you want to say something before we come back?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, just point out something that we just heard a moment ago and draw attention to it, that the free spaces run on donations. That's actually astounding, given the Beehive activity. And when we talk about donations, we don't mean the type of donation that the Ford Foundation gives or that corporate corporations. We're talking about this kind of donation. I just wanted to, I'm sure that jar is still going to be around, and I think that's something that really requires some, some honoring from only them as ain't got, support them as ain't got.
That is a phenomenal example of organizing.
Yeah. Thanks for coming up. So I'd like to hear some of what was just said in small groups. So we'd kind of like to hear at least a little bit, something from each group, and then we'll have a little bit fun back and forth if you have any questions from our guests, anybody in particular, or in general. So on anything that hasn't been said yet, the next 20 minutes or so is going to be the time to do that. And I'd like to ask that we start off by folks who have not had an opportunity to speak up yet. To do that, I'd like to first start by asking, if anybody in this group that is on the east side of the room has anything that y'all would like to chime in with.
I'm glad I'm here. I learn a lot.
Awesome.
That's what I'm gonna say. That's
Yeah, I just say I learned a lot too. Like, for example, I didn't know that military ID was not acceptable. I was like, what? It's pretty scary. Yeah. I'm actually really glad I'm here because, I'm more educated.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Was there anything that came up in the small group discussion that you found particularly interesting?
Basically, you're talking about organizing and how draining it can be, because it's kind of like take 2 steps forward and like 3 steps back, and it's like you're finding like something stupid like voter IDs, but it's just keeping people drained, and you're constantly trying to organize, and you kind of not. I mean, you're getting somewhere, but it feels like such small steps that it's like, the point. Yeah, that's frustrating.
Folks in one in the middle group, what was on your mind?
We were thinking about how, like, I was expecting to hear more of a critique about why this worked, and the idea of this legitimizing the electoral system as flawed as it is. And we were talking about like how some of the messaging around the voter ID campaign is saying, like, don't worry, those undocumented immigrants won't be able to vote, and explicitly reinforcing sort of reactionary politics as part of it, but then pointing to things like the OAP video series as the kind of organizing that can fight for concrete wins at the same time as pushing, like lifting up voices that have been traditionally marginalized on a deeper systemic level throughout the history that get at some of the roots of the problem. So thinking about how concrete organizing, even though it sometimes can reinforce the negative, can also build a base and build consciousness moving towards more transformative and bigger goals in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of sums up what we talked about, but I think what was poignant was what Mr. Cole said about like where the funding is going on this amendment, and like how the messaging and the narrative is so tied to where the funding is going. So it wouldn't be so necessary or like critical to talk about like veterans or students if we're putting all the funding into the people who would mostly be affected. And so, yeah.
So I have kind of a couple of big questions that we could maybe get to also from that committee. But first, what about this committee that's on this side of the room? Anything that y'all would like to share? You solved it. Oh, tell me more.
Yeah, the website, what do you got to say, man?
So I talked a little bit about how I thought, for me personally, viewing kind of this whole thing more in like a short-term lens is really helpful for better understanding how the mobilization and the organization against it can be more effective. And I really appreciated how throughout the evening people have raised the point that it's necessary to have like a coherent, articulate, non-wonky message that resonates with the average voter, so that that mobilization against the amendment can be effectively built. And yeah, for me, I guess I see that as breaking this amendment down into digestible pieces, so as to defeat it.
So you itching to jump on that?
Oh no, it just made me think of one other thing that we were talking about how can this amendment be used for momentum around engaging voters to think beyond Democrats and Republicans? That would be depressing.
So here was this question, because that's kind of get at the one of the big fundamental questions around why we wanted to have this conversation. Is doing this from legitimizing electoral politics and the electoral system, and what about that? So that's a question from y'all up here.
It is if that's the perspective you have to hold. If you choose to see it as that, then that's what it will be for you. If you choose to see it as a way of protecting vulnerable people in our society, whether you agree with the system the way it is or not, then that's what it'll be for you. I'm a person who doesn't believe that there's just one answer. I hear what he's saying about the one succinct kind of message. However, I feel like what's going to resonate with this particular group of people is going to be very different than what's going to resonate with this group. I spoke to an African American woman, and it was 25% of African Americans don't have a photo ID. She's like, and why don't they? So you never know what's going to trigger a person to see that this is flawed and that this is detrimental. So, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater is how I feel about things. You really have to look at the bigger picture, and sometimes there are things you have to do that you don't necessarily want to do or think are ideal, but it's what it is right now. How many times, I'm sure there's a lot of people who in general eat really healthy and all that kind of stuff, but I'm sure you have those moments where you're I'm hungry and this is all that's available. And yeah, it's not what I want to do and it's not the best choice for me, but I'm gonna just do this so that I can feel okay for the moment and get through this meeting, and I'm just gonna make up for it later and do some good work and things like that. So that's how I feel about it. I don't think for me there's an answer to it.
Well, I think we live with contradictions all the time. Is it legitimizing? Of course. Is it delegitimizing also? Of course. We know about the struggles going on in the tomato fields, right? Now, does fighting for better working conditions and bathroom breaks legitimize agribusiness the way it is? In a way, but you fight for it anyway because that's the world that we're in. And you use the organizing to undermine sort of the validity of why things are that way, but you still get to use what exists in order to fight what exists. I think that's really what we're doing every step of the way. The former head of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, who I had the privilege of meeting once 20-some years ago, was represented workers in nuclear power plants and was fighting to end nuclear power. He said that if you had an accident, as a representative of workers, if one of these plants had a meltdown, then tens of thousands of workers would be out of work overnight. So to represent his workers that meant he had to try to push for renewable energy. But that's just the way we live. It doesn't mean that those workers shouldn't fight for better wages and health and safety on the job.
And that doesn't mean I don't appreciate anarchists. Like, I feel like there's room for everything in the world, and there needs to be those people that are like, fuck this shit, I'm not participating, I'm not doing it. If that's what feels right for people, then you have to go with that. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
You got another burning question? Burning thought?
Well, it's a burning thought more than anything else. And just to kind of open up this conversation, I'm Michael Kaplan. I'm the candidate for the U.S. Senate that the corporates and apologists for this rotten, corporate, corrupted two-party system hate. When I'm about to talk about, you can understand exactly why I say that they hate me. I was in Ohio in 2004, and I watched election fraud happen, and I watched it happen openly, and it happens blatantly. And here's what I'm saying to you all, is a big reason why we're even fighting this issue right now on voter suppression is because in 2000, not in 2004, but in 2000, the Democratic Party refused to stand up for voter suppression. In Florida, you had 90,000 black people, mainly black people, were illegally purged from the voting rolls in Florida. And they blamed everything on Ralph Nader. And the same thing happened again with John Kerry in Ohio. The Democratic Party has refused to stand up to this issue. And it is for me, from where I sit at, it is the central issue we're even talking about this issue right now of voter ID and voter suppression. It's because this rotten, corporate, corrupted, pro-war, two-party sham democracy has refused to stand up for people. And that's why what I just said is the reason that apologists for this rotten, corporate, corrupted system hate me. I know progressive groups hate me for what I say, because what I just said is the truth. The Republicans are stealing elections, and the Democratic Party are allowing them to do it. They are not standing up and fighting back. In Ohio, perfect example. In Ohio, stuff not very well known. In one particular precinct in Ohio, of the 800 people that had the right to vote who were on the voter rolls in Ohio, 3,500 voted for George Bush. Let me say that again. 800 people registered to vote, 3,500 voted for George Bush.
So Michael,
And the Democratic Party didn't fight it.
I just wanted to cut you off because we got about 10 minutes to go.
Yeah.
We want to make sure we can focus on
Absolutely.
last 10
But
minutes about mobilizing.
I'd just like to say, my point being is that the reason we're fighting this is because the political establishment has not fought voter suppression, and even now they're still not really fighting it. They're just pretending to fight it.
The reason we're fighting this is because we're not standing up. We
Bingo.
are allowing the government to
Bingo.
be a small group of people, when in reality, the government is every single person sitting in this room. And we have got to remember that, and we have got to exercise that and execute that in everything we do. This isn't just about voting. This is about where you shop.
That's right.
This is about going to see movies, where you're investing your money. Are you going to see the big, mainstream movies? Are you investing in independent films? Like, who are you investing in? Every time you participate in something, you are in some way contributing, whether that's financially or energetically or whatever. And when we just say, well, there's nothing I can do about it, then we're absolutely right. Because if that's the stance we choose, then that's the reality we live.
I want to see if we have any last burning questions, burning thoughts from anyone who hasn't spoken yet in particular, but any last burning questions before we kind of get into a little last word kind of segment in the last few minutes. Anything that came up in groups or anything that's at the top of your head that hasn't been brought up yet? So, in the back, Eli, what's up?
Yeah, just one important thing I think that Susan said in our group, we were talking with this, she said she sees this as an opportunity to make connections with people organizing around this issue and to see those relationships built through this organizing as something good that can continue on after this. And I think combining that thought with what Mike was saying, and others have said about how the Democratic Party and the political establishment generally are abandoning a lot of people who are oppressed in this country. And so to see those relationships we build through these connections as also a way to continue this fight against the political establishment on all sorts of other issues. Yeah.
So it sounds like one way, as we mentioned before, to kind of use this opportunity as mobilizing beyond just this issue. Are there other ways that in y'all's experience of working on this issue so far, things how we could be doing better on that front, or opportunities people could take around voter restriction to kind of leverage that into mobilizing beyond just voting?
One of my challenges in the work that I've been doing is that I am so brand new to organizing, and I'm so brand new to the north side of Minneapolis. So the main thing that I have continually brought up in staff meetings and interactions is this is about relationship building. Like, it's important for me to get to know the community and the people in the community and not come in on my horse with my shield and my sword going, I'm gonna save you. No, I'm coming in with my hands and my feet going, what can I do? How can I help? How can I be a part of creating the change you want to see in your community? What things are important to you? Where do your values lie? It's not for me to come in and tell you how you should live. I think that's a big problem that we have as Americans, is we seem to think like, yeah, our way is the right way. Whether that's our way as an individual or our way as a community or our way as a country, and that, yeah, if you just do it our way, you'll be fine. It's like, we have to acknowledge that we're all different, and that's not good or bad. It's beautiful. It allows us to know who we are because of the differences we see in other people. You know, how do I understand myself as female if male doesn't exist? How do I understand myself as African American if something else doesn't exist? I want to see, one of the things I'm trying to do over north, and this is just on a personal level because my job is done November 14th. I'm working through the election. And then, but personally, I want to see the organizing has to happen around things that are not urgent, that are not political. The organizing needs to happen around community events. The organizing needs to happen around just gathering people together for things to celebrate rather than always things to fight. And you know, if you think about it, if you have a family that gets together every Sunday and has dinner, when there's a problem, they're already mobilized. But if you have a family that only gets together once a year on a holiday, it becomes very hard to mobilize 6 months later when a problem arises within the family. And I think the same becomes true of us as citizens and, you know, people sharing this space together, is that if we're mobilizing around positive things on a regular basis and having dialogue and having conversations and checking in with people and, you know, extending ourselves to people, then when the time comes for these urgent things, we're already ready. And it's a matter of just fine-tuning. Just this whole emergency mode, I'm not feeling this. Like, it's not fun doing this work when it's like, okay, we've got 3 months to change thousands of minds across Minnesota, and you've got $10. Go! It's like, oh, okay. You know, so I think that's an important thing to think about, is mobilizing around things that are not just negative or not just fights. Mobilize around creating a park in a neighborhood. Find other things to mobilize around on a regular basis.
So, I'm coming up on time, and I want to give all our guests kind of a little last one. But for the sake of giving them all 1 or 2 minutes to think about what the most inspirational thing to say will be, I'd like to invite each of you again to now just turn to the 1 or 2 people next to you and have a quick conversation about how you might mobilize over the next 3 weeks until the election, or beyond, around this issue, and how we might use that, how you might use that as kind of a leverage point to talk about the society that you would like to see. And if you'd like, you could use this time to make a little bit of a commitment to a couple of those people sitting next to you about something that you might do around this over the next 3 weeks. So quick 1 to 2 minute conversation with the people next to you, and then we'll come back again. Okay, so I'm going to get some final thoughts from each of our guests before we close out, although definitely feel free to hang around and continue the conversation once we're officially done. And we're going to start with Eric. So the question is just going to be, in a minute, minute and a half or less, What would you like to see your kind of mobilizing over the next 3 weeks, and do you have any other final thoughts?
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, thanks again for coming out. So I guess for the next 3 weeks, I would just imagine like focusing on the relationships that everyone is building, and I think it is important that we defeat this amendment for sure. But it's also important that we focus on like the contradictions that we are holding with, like we are continuing to operate within sort of a really oppressive system, and we also have visions for something else that we're working towards. So, and I've just been like in this world of democracy, like what is democracy for the last few months, and like the process that we've been operating in with these videos and with all these different constituencies has been a totally different form of democracy than I've experienced, I think. So it's like, even though we're kind of working in this like system, I don't know what to call it, like it is sort of revolutionary to work on making it more democratic and making it open, and that sort of within this individual transformation and systemic transformation, like the revolution can be happening while we work in the system and towards something else. So defeat the amendment and continue to be awesome people.
Yeah. Mr. Cole, you next?
Oh, what magic words can I find? Find 3 to 10 hours between now and November 6th to volunteer in some way, shape, or form on either or both of the amendments that are being put on the ballot. Get your buttons and wear them. I've had so many random conversations with people from the buttons I wear where people are like, what's that about? What's the voter ID amendment? So because that's what has to happen. Conversations have to happen, definitely with the voter ID amendment. As Catherine mentioned, that it went from 80 down to 52. So that doesn't happen just because, it happens because people talk to each other and explain things to each other. So find some sort of time. Come to knock. I will accept you with open arms. I give away hugs freely. I give snacks. But whatever organizations you can find, or even on your own, you know, going to events, talking to your friends and neighbors, family, things like that. But definitely try to make some time to be engaged in this, because this is going to affect all of us. It's not just going to affect the people that are going to be marginalized. And then make a plan for the day after and the week after, whatever that looks like. I know I'm working on planning a party that's going to have a lot of alcohol involved, because we've all been working really, really hard and we need to just let loose.
And ginger beer.
Yeah, and ginger beer for those who prefer, yes. So make some sort of plan for something after November 6th, where you can bring people together and start talking about, like, so what's next? What are people feeling drawn to? What are people feeling inspired to create? And start creating those things, and really try to not just focus on the fighting parts. Yeah. Like, there are things we have to fight, but there's also so much we have to celebrate.
Thank you. Susan, what magic moments do you have to share?
I don't know if I used my 2 minutes wisely, but I was interested. But yeah, I guess in the next 3 weeks, I would like to see people using this time to sort of like to have the conversation, but also to be able to like push the conversation about like what are the contradictions and like what are the lies in our system, and like how is this amendment demonstrative of that, and how can we best defeat this amendment so that we can go back to doing the work that is important to us, and how can we create the conditions in our daily lives that let us do this work for revolution. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Coda, you get the final say.
Likely. So pay attention to the news, private conversations, snatches heard on the bus, because I think we really are living in the time when the system is delegitimizing itself. and that's happening one way or another. And just to sort of look at this particular struggle in the context of just, for example, what's been happening in the national African American community with a series of uprisings around the Jena 6, Oscar Grant, Troy Davis, Trayvon Martin, New York stop and frisk, voter suppression. These are not about police brutality. This is not about the electoral system. This is about dignity and people's willingness to stand up and fight for what's theirs, what's legitimately theirs. That's the, if you will, the revolutionary core of this. And thinking about it in terms of elections is really a distraction from that. And I think that the relationships that are built, you can't build those long-term relationships that we need for the long haul based on lies and deceptions. We have to go to what the heart of the matter is, what these issues are. And to be brutally honest, how we do that in the long run is more important than whether we win or lose on this one. If we win this, then, and we win it nationally, the right will find another pathway to achieve what they want to achieve. If they win, we will have to find other pathways to achieve what we want to achieve. Either way, we will need to have each other on our radar screens. We need to have the visibility of the other communities that are struggling and that are affected by what's coming down the pike. And that is about building genuine struggles with integrity and calling out, like you did, what are the ways in which we are carrying forward in our practice weaknesses that are going to come back and bite us down the road if we don't deal with them.
How about some thank you from all of our guests?
And I'd like to say thank you to Jamie for